When my HOA flooded my land with trash and laughed in my face, I spent 2 weeks planning the perfect revenge they never saw coming. Tons of sewage is the only language they understand. Please like and comment your thoughts on this calculated revenge. I never wanted trouble. After working as a civil engineer for nearly 40 years, I was finally ready for a quiet life with my wife, Angela. We had spent decades planning for retirement, dreaming of a peaceful home where we could garden, enjoy barbecues, and finally have time for ourselves. That's why we moved to Willow Creek Estates, a seemingly perfect community just outside Charleston, South Carolina. The houses were well kept, the streets were clean, and it looked like the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other and kids rode their bikes without a care in the world. But beneath that picture-perfect facade, I quickly realized that this place was anything but welcoming. At least, not to people like us. The first sign came within days of moving in. People weren't exactly friendly. They weren't outright rude either, but there was a distance, a stiffness in the way they greeted us. The friendly waves I expected never came. Conversations between neighbors would quiet down when Angela and I walked by. We chalked it up to people being reserved, but then the real issues began. We started receiving notices from the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Small fines at first, little infractions that didn't seem like a big deal on their own, but they kept piling up. The first was a letter informing us that our front yard was in violation of landscaping guidelines. Angela had spent weeks designing a flower bed full of tulips and roses, carefully arranging them to create something truly beautiful, only to be told that they weren't HOA approved. I checked the neighborhood guidelines and nothing explicitly forbade them. In fact, some houses had almost identical setups, yet we were the only ones receiving a fine. When I brought this up at the next HOA meeting, Lisa Calloway, the HOA president, gave me that condescending smile I would come to know all too well. "Oh, we're just trying to maintain consistency in the neighborhood," she said in that sweet but patronizing tone, as if she were explaining something to a child. I wanted to argue, but I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't about flowers. This was about control. Lisa ran the HOA like it was her personal fiefdom, dictating which families fit in and which ones didn't. And from the very beginning, she had decided that Angela and I didn't belong. The fines kept coming. $100 for a mailbox that wasn't regulation size, $250 for leaving our trash bins too close to the curb, $500 for parking my truck in the driveway instead of inside the garage. Each time I checked the rules, and each time I found that we weren't doing anything that others in the neighborhood weren't also doing. But no one else seemed to be getting fined. It became obvious what was happening. It wasn't just about rules, it was about us. Lisa and her friends on the HOA board didn't like that we had moved in. They didn't like that Angela, a black woman, was living in their neighborhood. It was never anything overt. People like Lisa were too careful for that. But it was in the way Angela was ignored at community gatherings, the way our neighbors avoided making small talk, the way we always seemed to get singled out for violations that others were never punished for. Still, we tried to ignore it, hoping that if we kept our heads down, things would settle. That hope ended the morning I stepped outside and saw the disaster in my front yard. The stench hit me before I even opened the door. It was the unmistakable smell of rotting garbage. I walked out onto the porch and stopped dead in my tracks. Our entire front yard and driveway were covered in trash. Bags of old food, broken furniture, rusted appliances, even a few shattered toilets. Angela came outside a second later, gasping in horror. "John, what the hell?" I scanned the street, my jaw tightening, and that's when I saw them. 2 men in Willow Creek HOA maintenance uniforms climbing into a golf cart, casually driving away as if they hadn't just trashed my property. That was it. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. This was a message. Lisa wasn't just trying to fine us into submission, she was trying to force us out. I stormed over to Lisa's house, fury boiling in my veins. She was already waiting for me, standing on her pristine front porch with that same smug smile. "Oh dear," she said, tilting her head like she actually cared. "Looks like someone has a little trash problem. You might want to take care of that before it starts bringing property values down." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. "This was you," I said through gritted teeth. Lisa just shrugged. "Prove it." I knew I wouldn't get anywhere arguing with her. The HOA board was made up of her friends, and they covered for each other. Any complaint I filed would be ignored or investigated and dismissed. That night, as I lay in bed with the smell of rotting garbage still clinging to the air, I realized that playing by the rules wasn't going to work. If Lisa and the HOA wanted to play dirty, then fine. I'd play dirtier. The next morning, I reviewed the security footage from my front door camera, and there it was, clear evidence of the HOA's maintenance crew dumping trash onto my property at 3 a.m. It was enough to confront them, but not enough to actually stop them. I needed more. I started digging, checking public records, and that's when I found something interesting. A recent rezoning proposal for Willow Creek. The HOA had quietly partnered with a real estate development company, and their plan was simple: push certain homeowners out, buy their properties at a discount, and then redevelop the land into high-end townhomes. And guess whose house was at the top of their list? Ours. Lisa had been orchestrating the entire thing, targeting homeowners she didn't want in the neighborhood, using fines and harassment to make them desperate enough to sell. I wasn't the only victim either. The Rodriguezes, a Hispanic family down the street, had been fined for having a trampoline in their backyard, even though no one could see it from the street. Mr. Sanders, a retired veteran, had been threatened with eviction for hanging an American flag that was deemed too large. Angela had tried to book the community center for a gathering, only to be told it was fully booked, yet somehow every other event held there seemed to involve Lisa's friends. This wasn't about HOA rules, it was about power. Lisa was running a full-scale property grab, forcing out people she didn't like so she could turn a profit. I sat down at my desk and started sketching out a plan. As a former engineer, I knew exactly how the neighborhood's drainage system worked. And as I reviewed the infrastructure of the HOA's office, a small brick building near the community pool, I found something Lisa had probably never even thought about. She had cut costs when it was built, skipping certain plumbing safeguards, which meant the office had no backflow prevention system. And that meant if someone were to redirect high-pressure sewage back into the building, Lisa's pristine, white marble-floored office would become a toxic swamp. I smiled. She wanted to drown us in garbage? Fine. I'd make sure she got buried in something much, much worse. I knew that if I wanted to take Lisa and her HOA empire down, I needed to be smart. Getting angry wouldn't solve anything, and complaining through the official channels was pointless. The system was rigged in her favor. I had to think like an engineer, like a problem solver. And the problem here wasn't just Lisa. It was the power she held over the neighborhood. That power came from fear. Fear of fines, of harassment, of losing everything. But power like that only worked if people kept obeying. I wasn't going to obey anymore. I spent the next few days putting together a plan, gathering everything I needed to hit her where it hurt the most. It wasn't enough to get back at her. I wanted to expose her. I wanted to make sure she would never be able to do this to anyone else again. First, I needed more proof. The security footage I had of HOA workers dumping trash on my lawn was a start, but I needed to tie it directly to Lisa. I started talking to neighbors, carefully choosing the ones who had also been targeted. I kept things casual at first, chats over coffee, quick conversations in driveways. I needed to know just how deep this went. The more I talked, the more obvious it became that Lisa had been running her little operation for years. She wasn't just targeting me and Angela. She had been pushing out families she didn't like for a long time. The Rodriguezes told me they had almost sold their house after months of fines and threats. Mr. Sanders had considered moving when the HOA tried to evict him over his flag. Everyone had the same story: unjust fines, bogus violations, endless harassment. And in every case, the homes that were pressured to be sold, were eventually bought up by a real estate company called Westbridge Properties. That was the key. I dug into Westbridge's records and found out that Lisa's husband was a senior partner there. The scam was simple. Lisa used the HOA to drive homeowners out, and Westbridge bought the properties at a discount. Then, they either flipped them for profit or developed them into high-end rentals. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. I even found emails that had been leaked from a disgruntled HOA board member, detailing how Lisa had manipulated votes and ignored community concerns to push her agenda. One email, in particular, sealed it for me. Some of these homes were never meant for long-term occupancy. We'll apply pressure where necessary. Once they're desperate enough to sell, we'll have buyers ready. The Harrises will be the first to go. That was it. That was the proof I needed. But I wasn't going to just hand it over to the authorities and hope for the best. No, I was going to make sure that Lisa felt the consequences of her actions firsthand. That's where my expertise came in. As a former civil engineer, I knew how the neighborhood's infrastructure worked. I pulled up old schematics of Willow Creek's drainage system and studied them carefully. The HOA office was built on a slightly lower elevation than the surrounding area, and because Lisa had cut corners when it was constructed, the building lacked a proper backflow prevention system. That meant if a high-pressure sewage line were to be reversed, the entire office would be flooded with wastewater. It was perfect. I called an old friend, Mick Darnell, who owned Darnell's Septic and Waste Removal. I told him I had a plumbing emergency and needed some specialized assistance. Mick wasn't the kind of guy to ask too many questions, and when I explained the situation, he just laughed and said, "Oh, buddy, I got you covered." We set a date, a Thursday night, just before the big HOA meeting Lisa had planned with her investors. The plan was simple. Late that night, Mick and I would reroute one of the neighborhood's main sewage lines directly into the HOA office's plumbing. The pressure from the main line would be enough to force raw sewage up through every drain, toilet, and pipe in the building. The best part, because Lisa had cheaped out on construction costs, there was no fail-safe. There would be nothing stopping the backflow. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it would be too late. Thursday night arrived, and everything was set. Mick pulled up in his truck, and we worked fast. I'd already marked the exact spot where we needed to make the connection. Using industrial-grade equipment, we attached a temporary valve that would force the flow in the opposite direction. The whole process took less than an hour. Once it was done, we tested it. Just a small amount, enough to confirm that the system was working. A dark, thick sludge immediately started creeping into the pipes. It was working. I reset the valve to trigger at exactly 9 a.m. the next morning, right when Lisa and the board members would be arriving for their meeting. The next morning, I sat on my front porch with a fresh cup of coffee, waiting. At exactly 8:59 a.m., Lisa pulled into the HOA parking lot in her white BMW, stepping out in one of her perfectly pressed outfits. A few other board members followed, carrying folders and laptops. I could see them through the glass doors, chatting, preparing for their meeting. Then, right on cue, 9 a.m. At first, nothing happened. Then, I saw it. A sudden gurgling sound erupted from inside the building. Confused looks appeared on the board members' faces. Lisa turned toward the bathroom door just as a geyser of raw sewage exploded from the toilets and sinks. Black sludge shot up from every drain, coating the walls, the floor, the expensive furniture. A second later, the sprinkler system, mistakenly sensing a liquid overflow, activated, spraying the entire office with filthy wastewater. Lisa's scream was muffled by the wave of sludge that poured down from the air vents. She tried to run, but the floor was already ankle-deep in waste, making it impossible to move without slipping. HOA board members gagged and scrambled toward the exit, their once neat business attire now covered in filth. By the time the doors burst open, a tidal wave of sewage surged out, spilling into the parking lot. Lisa stumbled outside, her pristine white blazer now a dripping brown mess. She stood there, stunned, frozen in horror as news reporters, who I had anonymously tipped off the night before, arrived just in time to catch the entire spectacle on camera. The footage of Lisa and her board members wading through ankle-deep sewage went viral within hours. By noon, HOA sewage scandal was trending nationwide. Local news stations ran headlines like Willow Creek HOA drowns in its own corruption and residents fight back against HOA tyranny. Reporters dug deeper and soon uncovered everything: the unjust fines, the forced evictions, the connection between Lisa and Westbridge Properties. Lisa tried to deny everything, even as she stood there covered in evidence. But then the final blow came. One of her own board members, desperate to save himself, flipped. He provided emails, financial records, everything. Lisa was done. By the end of the day, the HOA office was shut down. Lisa was under investigation for fraud and corruption, and Willow Creek Estates was officially free from her rule. As for me, I was never charged with anything. The cause of the plumbing malfunction was officially ruled as a failure due to poor maintenance. HOA negligence. A poetic ending, considering how Lisa had spent years fining people for not following maintenance guidelines. Angela and I celebrated that night with a bottle of wine on our porch, watching as the last remaining traces of Lisa's reign were hosed off the sidewalks. Angela turned to me, smiling. "John," she said, "I think you just became a neighborhood legend." I took a sip of my drink, listening to the distant sound of Lisa screaming at her lawyer over the phone. Damn right I did. By the time the sun had fully risen over Willow Creek Estates, the once pristine office of the Homeowners Association had become an unrecognizable disaster zone. Lisa Calloway, once the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, stood drenched in filth, her white blazer now a dripping, brown-streaked mess, her designer shoes completely ruined as she tried, and failed, to keep her balance in the thick sludge that covered the parking lot. The sheer stench of the scene was overwhelming, a foul cocktail of sewage and rot that clung to everything it touched. She wasn't alone, either. The entire HOA board had been caught in the deluge, their once neat business attire transformed into a humiliating display of failure. They gagged and sputtered as they tried to escape the rising muck, slipping and stumbling as reporters swarmed in, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in their faces. One particularly eager reporter wasted no time getting to the point. "Ms. Calloway, how do you respond to accusations that the HOA has been unfairly targeting homeowners?" Lisa, still trying to wipe sludge from her face, scowled. "No comment," she hissed, voice shaking with barely contained rage. Another reporter didn't let up. "Can you explain why leaked emails show a direct connection between the HOA and Westbridge Properties? Did you intentionally fine certain homeowners to drive them out?" Lisa froze. Her face, already contorted in anger, paled slightly. The smell of sewage was bad, but she knew the real threat wasn't the filth covering her. It was the scandal now unfolding in front of the entire town. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, trying to suppress a grin as the chaos unfolded. Angela stepped out, holding a fresh mug, her expression equal parts amusement and disbelief. "You did that, didn't you?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest before answering. "I have no idea what you're talking about." She smirked. "Sure you don't." We stood there together, watching as the police arrived. Not for me, but for Lisa. An officer stepped forward, a folder in hand, and handed it directly to her. "Ms. Calloway," he said, his tone even but firm, "this is a warrant for a full financial investigation of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, including your personal accounts." The color drained from her face as the officer continued. "We've received multiple reports of fraud, embezzlement, and unlawful property violations. You will need to come with us for questioning." For the first time since I had moved into Willow Creek, Lisa didn't have a smug response. She stood there, mouth opening and closing, unable to find the words. Some of the HOA board members stepped away from her, clearly trying to distance themselves. One of them, a nervous-looking man in a sweat-stained button-up, suddenly blurted out, "It was her. She made us do it. I didn't even want to find those people." The betrayal hit Lisa like a slap, and for a brief moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the months of fines, the harassment, the garbage piled on my property. I remembered the smugness in her voice when she told me to prove it. And now? Now she was the one buried in filth, both literally and figuratively. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. News stations picked up the story, dubbing it the HOA sewage scandal. Reporters dug into everything: Lisa's connections with Westbridge, the bogus fines, the illegal property deals. As it turned out, Lisa and her husband had been pocketing HOA funds for years, using money collected from residents to finance their personal projects, all while bullying people out of their homes for profit. The backlash was swift. A town hall meeting was called, and for the first time, Lisa wasn't the one leading it. The remaining HOA board members, what was left of them anyway, tried to explain themselves, but no one was interested in hearing excuses. One by one, they were voted out, replaced by new members who had actually lived in the neighborhood to make it a community, not a dictatorship. Sarah Martin, the widow who had given me the leaked emails, was elected as the new president. The Rodriguezes took on treasury duties, ensuring fines would only be issued for real violations, not for personal vendettas. And me? They wanted me on the board, but I had no interest in playing politics. I had done my part. Instead, I volunteered to help fix the community garden and set up a real neighborhood watch, one that looked out for the people, not just property values. Lisa, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. The financial investigation uncovered hundreds of thousands of dollars in misused funds, and by the time the legal dust settled, she and her husband were forced to sell their home to pay back debts. No one in Willow Creek shed a tear when the for sale sign went up in their yard. She was gone, just like she had tried to force so many others out. And the best part? The old HOA office, the one that had been flooded with sewage, was never restored. No one wanted to put money into fixing it, and eventually it was torn down. In its place, the new HOA board decided to turn the space into something actually useful: a public park for the community, complete with a playground, a dog park, and a small library station. They even let Angela help design the garden. "So," she said one evening as we walked past the nearly finished park, "how does it feel, knowing you played a part in all this?" I looked around, seeing kids running across the grass, neighbors actually talking to one another instead of glaring suspiciously from their porches. I thought about the past few months, the frustration, the anger, the long nights wondering if we had made a mistake moving here. Then I saw the sign by the entrance of the park, the one they had just put up that morning. Willow Creek Community Park, a place for everyone. I smiled. Feels pretty damn good. Months passed, and life in Willow Creek settled into something I had almost given up on: normalcy. The fines disappeared. The fear was gone. The petty drama that had once dictated daily life faded, replaced by something I hadn't expected when we first moved in: a real sense of community. People started helping each other out instead of reporting each other for violations. Block parties became a regular thing. The neighborhood started to feel like home. And then, one afternoon, I got a package in the mail. No return address, just a plain brown box. Inside was a small plaque, mounted with a preserved chunk of concrete from the old HOA office. There was a note attached. A reminder that bullies always get what's coming to them. "Enjoy your retirement, John. You earned it." Angela read the note over my shoulder and let out a laugh. "You really are a legend now," she teased. I just shook my head, grinning. I put the plaque up in my workshop, right next to my toolbox. Not as a trophy, not as a reminder of revenge, but as a testament to something more important: the fact that no matter how powerful people think they are, no matter how much they try to control and intimidate others, there's always a way to fight back. And sometimes the best justice isn't a courtroom or a lawsuit. Sometimes it's a well-timed wave of sewage.